All right, let's get started coding. So if you log into your GitHub account on github.com and then you click the Codespaces link, you'll be brought to this page here. And this is where you can start a GitHub Codespace from scratch. Now, I'll also say that it's possible to start a GitHub Codespace from a repository, and at the end of the series, we'll see how to do that. But you can also start from a template. And in this case, I'm going to start with the blank template. Now, I'm not speeding up the video here. I will speed up the video during some of the parts where we're waiting for Azure to provision services, but I want you to see exactly how fast this is going to start up. And this, by default, is going to use that 2-core instance in the back end. And here's the terminal, and there you go. That's really how long it took, just a few seconds to spin this up. Now, if we look, we'll see that Python is already installed. Python 3.10 is already installed. And you've got something, again, if you've used Visual Studio Code, this is going to look very familiar. Now, I do want to talk really quickly about saving these hours, because again, you do have a limited number of free hours. By default, if you leave a code space running and do not explicitly stop it, it will shut down automatically after 30 minutes and you will no longer be charged, or it won't take anything away from your free quota. However, you can change that. So if you go over to your menu over here in the upper right hand corner, and then you click on Settings, and then under Codespaces, and you go down here to this default idle timeout, you can change this to as little as 5 minutes and as much as 240 minutes. I found 5 minutes to be a little bit limiting, so I've set it to 10 minutes. But then that way, if you forget to shut one down, you'll only waste 10 minutes. Now, if you want to save even more time, you can actually go down here to the lower right-hand corner where it says Codespaces. Click that; it'll bring up the command palette, and you can tell it to stop the current code space immediately, and no more of your time will be taken up. All right. So with that, let's go ahead and get set up a little bit here. And I'm going to, first thing, like I said in the previous video, is you can use many of the extensions that you can also use on the desktop. And that includes the Python extension. So just like on the desktop, you'll go over here to the extensions pane, and it's going to bring up the popular extensions first. And just as before, as it has been for a long time, the Python extension is the most popular one. Click on it, click the green Installing Codespaces button. And again, I'm not going to speed up the video because this only takes a few seconds. Now, one thing that you do want to watch out for is let me get rid of this real quick here, go back over here, is that you do not install the pre-release version, because there is a pre-release version as indicated by this icon that is available. And I've done that by mistake a couple of times, and the pre-release version has had some issues with it, but that's why it's a pre-release. But the release version does not have those issues. All right, great. So that's going to give us things like, for our purposes, going to give us things like syntax highlighting and auto-completion, auto-indentation, and some other interesting. It also has virtual environment support. I'm actually not, however, going to put this in a virtual environment, and the reason is because the GitHub Codespaces are intended to be tied to a GitHub repository, and a GitHub repository is probably only going to have one project that would only need one virtual environment anyway. So I'm actually going to not create a virtual environment in this case. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and install Flask. And I would do that, pip install Flask, just like I would on the desktop, because what I've got here is a terminal into a Linux instance. And so there it has installed Flask. I could, by saying pip freeze grep for Flask. There we go. Little sanity check to see that it actually was installed. All right, next what I'll do is I can go ahead and start to create the application. So I'll go over here, create a new folder, and I will call this, well, we'll call it the same thing I did for the meeting, MemPy, and then in here, I'll create a new file, app.py. Now this is not going to be anything, this application is not going to be impressive. It is an MVP, a minimum viable product. And I'm using a lot of defaults. I'm completely ignoring PEP 8. Well, not completely, but ignoring a lot of PEP 8 stuff, also because of screen real estate. But I'm not going to be talking about anything really cool about Flask or even cool about Python. This is about the tooling. So what I'll need to do is I'll need to, first of all, to get started, I'll need to from Flask import. Notice I get my IntelliSense and everything just like I would on the desktop. Import, I'm going to need the Flask app. I'm going to need render template. I'm going to need redirect, and I'm going to need request. Eventually, I'll need all of these. All right, now these squigglies here, notice that a lot of these are coming from Pylint. I don't like the way that Pylint is configured by default on Codespaces, so I'm going to hit Control-Shift-P or Command-Shift-P on the Mac, and I'm going to go down here and say linting. Enable disable linting. I'm just going to disable this, and it'll make things a little bit cleaner. In a production application where you're working on a larger application, the linter can be useful, but in this case, it's going to get in our way. And then what I'll do is I'll create an instance of the app, Flask name. I'll create a route with the route decorator that will specify the URL, in this case, the root of the site, to match, and then route the request to this handler function. And all I'm going to do is return a rendered template. Now that rendered template is going to be called index.html, and it is going to be found inside of the default location for templates inside of Flask, which is inside of the root of the application in a folder named templates. So I'll create a file called index.html. And you'll also notice here that I'm getting language support for HTML as well. And say body h2, welcome to the MemPy blog. Because the demo app that we're going to be creating is a very, very simple, the world's simplest blog. Anybody and everybody can make posts, anybody and everybody can comment on those posts, and then when the comments are posted, then we will run those comments through the language service for the from the Azure Cognitive Services and perform sentiment analysis on them, and then display those scores. But that comes later. For right now, we have everything that we need to run a Flask application. Now, you'll want to, if you're following along, make sure that you follow some of my structure here, because I have a Flask application named app inside of a Python file named app, and thus a module named app. And if you do that, if you have a module named app with a Flask application named app inside of it, in order to run it, I'll need to be in my MemPy directory down here. All I have to do is say Flask run. And there we go. Now the Flask application is running. Ignore this little notification for now. We'll talk about it more in a minute. Now, if you had a more complex application that was structured differently, yes, you could definitely tell it where that main app is located. But for now, keep it simple. Use the defaults. Now, notice that it says that it is running the server on the localhost address, which is 127.0.0.1 and port 5000. Now, if you're running this on your desktop and you run the Flask server, you would only be able to access the development server from your desktop machine. Well, this may seem to be a problem because Codespaces does not, as of yet, have a web browser built in. That may be a feature they add someday. I don't know. But right now, there is no web browser built into Codespaces. So how do we access this application? How do we see what it looks like and work with it? Well, if you go over here to ports, you're going to see that these are forwarded ports. So what it's saying here is it's taken that port 5000 and it's forwarded it to this very long and rather ugly address, but that's okay, because all we need to do is click on this browser, open in browser button, And in just a few seconds, we'll see welcome to the MemPy blog. And if we look back over here in our terminal, we'll see the logs. And so what's happening is Codespaces is forwarding this address to this URL. And that's going to come in really handy as we go on. So you don't have to remember port numbers or mess with doing the routing or forwarding yourself. It's all done for you by GitHub Codespaces. Right? So that'll wrap it up for this video. In the next video, we're going to take a look at how to deploy this to Microsoft Azure. We're actually ready to do it at this point.